Go deeper, make it quick inside, Chinese girl gasped to shy rancher. They said the land was cursed, but what they did to her that night was far worse than any curse. Mylin, 23 years old, had come from the bustling, crowded streets of San Francisco to this forgotten western town, a place called Redemption Gulch, seeking the roots of a family she had only known through faded photographs and whispered stories. She arrived with nothing but a small, intricately carved jade bracelet that had once belonged to her great-grandmother, a piece of cool, green stone that felt like a link to a forgotten world. The sky was a pale, dusty gray, and the wind carried the taste of grit and regret. Every face she met turned to her with a hard, unwelcoming stare, as if her very presence was an ill omen, as if she had carried death in the pocket of her traveling coat. No one spoke to her at first. They only watched, their eyes following her every move. Then, the whispers began, slithering through the small crowd that had gathered near the general store. The pale green glint on her wrist caught the last, weak light of the dying day. An old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles and suspicion, gasped, pointing with a gnarled, shaking hand. "It's the mark of the outsider," she rasped, her voice thin and sharp. She brought the curse back. Before Mylin could even form a question, to ask what they meant by this madness, a rough hand grabbed her arm. Then another seized her other arm, their grips like iron vices. Rough hands, calloused from labor and hardened by prejudice, pulled her from the wooden boardwalk and toward the center of a barren field. Her cries for help were lost in a chaotic symphony of barking dogs and the hollow clanging of distant cattle bells. The air grew thick with a collective panic, a contagious fear that had festered in this town for generations. "Please, let me go," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "I don't understand what you're talking about." But they didn't listen. Fear has no ears for reason. They dragged her across the parched earth to an old, splintered wooden cross that stood skeletal and forlorn in the middle of a dead wheat field. The cross was wrapped with frayed, torn rope and stained with the soot of old fires, a grim monument to past superstitions. The villagers tied her wrists to the crossbeam, binding them so tight that a painful numbness quickly spread to her fingers. An elderly man, his eyes wide with fervor, began mumbling a prayer, his words a frantic, incoherent drone. Others in the mob crossed themselves, their faces grim and determined. One man, his face shadowed by the brim of a sweat-stained hat, poured a circle of salt around her bare feet, a primitive ward against an evil they had invented themselves. The wind picked up, howling across the empty plain. Dust stung her eyes and cut across her face, whipping her long, dark hair wildly in the cold air. She tried to shout again, to reason with them, but her voice cracked, swallowed by the rising gale. They said it was for the good of the town, to protect their families. They said the last time that jade bracelet was seen in Redemption Gulch, a mine collapsed, and 3 families were buried alive. They said she was the omen returned, a specter from a past they refused to understand. From the quiet solitude of a small ridge overlooking the fields, a figure sat on horseback, a silent witness to the unfolding horror. Abner Finch, 58 years old, was a worn-out rancher who had lived on the outskirts of this very town for 2 decades, a ghost in his own life. His rough, weathered hands tightened on the worn leather of his saddle as fragmented memories of his own family flickered like a dying candle in his mind. The locals called him the Ridge Watcher, a man who observed the world but no longer participated in it. He had once had a wife, Sarah, and a young son, Thomas, both lost in the tragedy the townspeople called the Curse Fire. He knew it as the Great Collapse. Now, he watched the same ignorant madness, the same desperate need for a scapegoat, unfold once more. His old horse, a steady mare named Dusty, shifted beneath him, snorting into the dust-filled air. Abner raised a hand and gently brushed its mane, his tired eyes fixed on the girl tied to the cross. Her small frame trembled against the ropes, the pale green jade on her wrist flashing like a shard of broken glass in the dim, fading light. He felt something cold and hard twist inside his chest. It wasn't anger, not anymore. It wasn't even pity. It was something colder, sharper. It was the kind of bone-deep dread a man feels when he realizes the past is not a memory but a hungry beast, and it has come back to feed. He whispered to the wind, his voice barely a breath, "Not again." The villagers stepped back from the cross, forming a loose, menacing circle. One of them raised a lantern high. Its flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows and painting My Lin's terrified face in strokes of orange and black. For a terrifying moment, it looked as though they might actually set her on fire, to cleanse their town with an innocent's ashes. Abner gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw aching. He had seen this before. The same blind terror, the same lies whispered like prayers. And he remembered with searing clarity how it had ended the last time, with screams, with ash, with hastily dug graves and a silence that suffocated the truth. He pulled his hat low, hiding his eyes from the wind, and muttered to himself, "Goddamn fools. They still believe it." Then, a sound broke through the night, slicing through the wind and the muttering of the crowd. It was My Lin's voice, weak and strained, but shockingly clear. "If I die here," she called out, her words hanging heavy in the air, "will it end your curse?" The crowd went silent. The question landed among them like a stone in a still pond, its ripples spreading doubt. The old woman who had first pointed her out took an involuntary step back, her certainty faltering. For the first time, someone in that mob looked unsure. Abner's grip on the saddle tightened until his knuckles were white. He could turn Dusty around, ride away into the night, and let the ghosts of his past consume him in his lonely cabin. Or he could ride down that ridge and stop what he knew was a monstrous sin. The lantern flame wavered. The rope strained against My Lin's raw wrists. The sky turned a deeper shade of bruised purple as the last light of day bled out behind the hills. Abner exhaled, a long, slow breath. His horse pawed at the ground, sensing its rider's turmoil. And in that moment, he knew he couldn't remain a silent watcher again. Because if he did, another innocent would burn for a lie, and his own soul would be nothing but ash. As he gently nudged his horse forward, the wind carried her faint whisper, a prayer, or perhaps a curse of her own. For the first time in 20 years, Abner Finch aimed to find out the difference. But what if the curse everyone feared wasn't the one haunting the land, but the one they carried in their own hearts? The sharp crack of a rifle shot split the night. One shot, clean and decisive. The villagers froze, a herd of startled animals. The man holding the lantern dropped it. It shattered on the ground, spilling its flame and light across the dirt. From the encroaching darkness, Abner Finch rode in, slow and deliberate, his hat pulled low, his old rifle resting steady in one hand. "Untie her," he said. His voice was calm, almost lazy, but it carried the weight of 20 years of grief and silence. No one moved. They stared at the ridge watcher as if he were a phantom risen from the grave. So he fired again, this time into the air. The echo rolled across the field like a clap of thunder. That broke the spell. A few of the men turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness. The rest backed away, muttering about the devil himself coming for them, their courage dissolving as quickly as it had formed. When the last one had vanished, only My Lin, tied to the cross, and the old rancher remained in the eerie silence. Abner climbed down from his horse, his worn boot sinking into the dry soil. In the dim moonlight, the girl looked so small, her wrists raw and bleeding, her face streaked with tears and dirt. He let out a gruff sigh, muttering to himself, "Never thought I'd play the hero again." He pulled a well-used knife from his belt, walked to the cross, and sawed through the thick ropes. He caught her just as she slumped forward, her strength gone. "Easy now," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "You're safe." She tried to stand, but her legs gave out. Without a word, he lifted her, she weighed almost nothing, and placed her gently on Dusty's saddle. He took the reins and led the horse away from that field of madness, toward the winding canyon road that led to his secluded home. The sky was a vast, starless black, heavy with the promise of a coming storm. They reached his small cabin, tucked away and hidden behind a line of stoic pine trees. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of wood smoke, leather, and solitude. Abner gently helped her down and wrapped her in a thick wool blanket. He poured some water from a tin pitcher into a cup and held it to her lips. She drank greedily, her hands shaking. My Lin's voice, when it came, was a broken whisper. "Why? Why did they do that to me?" Abner didn't answer right away. He stared at the jade bracelet still gleaming on her wrist. "People get scared," he he said finally, his gaze distant. And when they're scared, they need someone to blame. It's easier than blaming themselves. Her breath grew shaky, and her hands clutched at her side, a spasm of pain twisting her features. Then she whispered something strange, her eyes half closed, her voice barely a breath. Go deeper, make it quick inside. Her voice faded into a soft sob, her body trembling under the heavy blanket. Abner's eyes narrowed. He blinked, unsure if she was delirious from the pain and terror or if the words held some other meaning. Still, he reached out, his rough, calloused hand coming to rest on her shoulder, an uncharacteristically gentle gesture. You'll be all right, kid, he said gruffly. You just need to rest for a moment. Her eyes met his. There was profound fear in them, but beneath it, he saw something else, something he hadn't seen directed at him in a very long time: trust. He saw a flash of another time, another face. His own son, Thomas, feverish and crying by the fire, asking him why the other children called their family cursed. Abner swallowed hard, pushing the painful memory back down into the depths where it lived. He adjusted the blanket around Mylin, making sure she was warm. Outside, the wind rattled the single window pane. A loose shutter clapped against the cabin wall, a lonely, rhythmic sound like a faltering heartbeat. Abner sat back heavily in his worn armchair, staring into the dying embers of the fire. He knew this wasn't over. The girl wasn't the only one haunted by that bracelet, by the lie it represented. And when dawn came, he would have to make a choice he had been avoiding for 20 years, whether to finally bury the past or to dig it up, no matter how many skeletons he might find. The next morning came slow and grey, the kind of morning that smelled like rain and regret. Abner stepped outside, a steaming mug of coffee in one hand, his eyes scanning the ridge. The world was quiet, almost too quiet. Inside the cabin, Mylin was awake. She sat by the small fire he had rekindled, turning the jade bracelet over and over in her hands as if it held all the answers she was desperately seeking. "Who is Li Wei?" she asked, her voice clearer now. Abner turned, the name hitting him like a cold wind. Li Wei, he repeated slowly, the name dredging up old ghosts. He worked the old mine. The one owned by Judge Hawthorne. The one that collapsed. She frowned, looking from the bracelet to his face. So he was real. Real enough, Abner replied, his tone grim. And trouble enough for everyone, it seems. By noon, they were riding out, Abner on Dusty and Mylin on a gentler, older horse he kept. The field where she had been tied stretched wide and empty, the splintered cross a dark slash against the horizon. The only sound was the wind scraping through the dry grass. Abner didn't talk much, he never did. But he kept one hand resting near the butt of his holstered gun. Just in case. They reached the Hawthorne farm. The place was a study in decay, forgotten by time and man. The barn roof was half gone, its timbers exposed like the ribs of a carcass. The windmill leaned at a drunken angle, its blade still and silent. The air itself seemed to carry the faint, burnt smell of old tragedy. Mylin slid off her horse and walked slowly toward the dilapidated porch. Something creaked inside the house. "Stay close," Abner said, his voice low. An old man stepped out from the shadows of the doorway. He had a long, white beard that was stained yellow with tobacco, and his eyes were as sharp and predatory as a hawk's. "Judge Hawthorne." "You shouldn't have come back here, Abner," the old man said, his voice a dry rustle. "And you shouldn't have brought her." Abner's jaw tightened. "Maybe you should have told folks the truth 20 years ago, Judge." Hawthorne let out a low, bitter laugh. "The truth doesn't feed a town, rancher. The truth doesn't keep order. Fear does." Before Abner could answer, two men emerged from behind the barn. They were farmhands, rough-looking and nervous, their eyes shifting from Abner to the judge. One carried a heavy shovel, the other a short, wicked-looking blade. "Looks like you brought friends," Abner muttered, swinging himself down from his horse. The fight was quick, ugly, and devoid of any romance. Abner, driven by a fury that had been dormant for 2 decades, moved first. He was an old man, and his bones creaked in protest, but his fist caught the taller man square on the jaw. The man grunted and stumbled back. My Lin, refusing to be a helpless victim again, grabbed a thick, broken piece of a fence post and swung it wildly. She missed, but the desperate act startled the second man long enough for Abner to land a blow that knocked him to the ground. When the dust settled, the two hands were groaning in the dirt, and Judge Hawthorne stood frozen on his porch, breathing heavily, his mask of authority shattered. It was then that My Lin noticed a large, leather-bound book lying on a rickety porch table, its pages yellow and brittle with age. She picked it up. It was a ledger, a diary of the mine's operations. Inside, written in the judge's own hand, were the words that changed everything. The shoddy materials used to save money. The warnings from the foreman that were ignored. The day of the collapse. And the cold, calculated decision afterward, a conspiracy among the town's leaders to cover up their lethal negligence by inventing the story of a curse, blaming it on the small community of Chinese workers and the strange, heathen charms they wore. My Lin's hands trembled as she read a passage aloud, her voice ringing with righteous anger. It was never a curse. It was just men. Men too greedy to be safe, and too cowardly to face their own mistakes. That her jade bracelet wasn't a mark of evil. The ledger mentioned it specifically. It had been a gift from her great-grandfather, Li Wei, to his wife, a symbol of protection for a child they were expecting. Abner stared at the page, the neat, damning script blurring before his eyes. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. His Sarah, his Thomas, they hadn't been taken by some malevolent spirit of the land. They had died because of this man's greed. All these years, he'd blamed ghosts that never existed, while the real monster lived just a few miles down the road. My Lin gently touched his arm. "It wasn't your fault, Abner," she said softly. For the first time, he didn't argue or retreat into his shell of grief. He just looked at her, at this brave young woman who had unearthed a truth he had been too broken to seek, and he nodded. "Maybe," he said, his voice thick with unspoken years of sorrow, "you're the daughter I never got to see grow up." Outside, the wind howled again, but it felt different now. It sounded less like a lament and more like a cleansing breath, as if the land itself had finally exhaled a long-held, poisonous secret. That night, a fire burned bright outside Abner's cabin. The wind carried the clean smell of pine and the acrid scent of old paper. Abner and My Lin stood close to the flames. Between them, on a flat stone, lay the judge's ledger. "Go on," Abner said quietly. My Lin hesitated for a moment, then picked up the heavy book and tossed it into the heart of the fire. The flames hissed and flared, greedily consuming the brittle pages, turning the written lies into black, curling ash. The sound was small, but final. A short distance away, leaning on a cane in the shadows, stood Judge Hawthorne. Abner had brought him there to witness it. The old man's face looked hollow in the firelight, but his sharp eyes were calm, resigned. He didn't say a word. When the last page of the ledger had turned to ash, he simply turned and walked away, a stooped figure disappearing into the vast darkness. Maybe he was finally ready to disappear with the lie he had lived for so long. My Lin watched until he was gone. "Do you think he's sorry?" she asked. Abner poked the fire with a long stick, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. "Some men are only sorry it's over," he said. "The rest are just sorry they got caught." For a long while, they sat in a comfortable silence, with no words needed, just the crackle of the fire and the sound of the wind moving through the trees. Then Abner looked at her, a glimmer in his tired eyes. "You ever really ridden a horse before?" She smiled faintly. "Not unless you count carousels." The next morning, Abner saddled Dusty and brought out the other horse, the one she'd ridden the day before. Its coat was dusty, its eyes patient. "Her name is Willow," he said. "You'll learn on her." He helped her climb up, his steadying hand on her arm as she found her balance. He walked beside her, one hand on the reins. "My boy, Thomas," Abner said, a rare, small smile breaking through his weathered face. "He used to fall off this mare a dozen times before he got it right. My wife, Sarah, she used to ride out here every morning." Thomas would chase her along the fence line, laughing so loud the birds would stop singing just to listen. Mylin looked down at him, at the profound sadness and newfound peace in his face. "What happened to them?" she asked gently. Abner's voice softened, losing its rough edges. "The mine. The same one that took your great-grandfather. Folks said it was the curse. But I know better now." He looked up at her, and his smile was real this time, the kind of smile that carried both pain and healing. "Guess I just needed someone to come along and remind me that life keeps moving, even after it kicks you flat." Willow took another step forward. The morning sun cut through the last of the morning fog, warm and golden. Mylin laughed as she almost lost her balance, and Abner's hand shot out to steady her. For the first time in 20 years, he laughed too, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to surprise even him. But deep inside, both of them knew the past wasn't entirely done with them yet. And what waited beyond that sunrise might be the hardest truth of all, the challenge of living again. The sun rose soft and golden across the valley, painting the land in hues of hope. The world that once felt so cursed now looked almost gentle. Mylin and Abner stood by the fence of a small corral, watching the horses graze in the distance. The old boards creaked under Abner's boots as he leaned forward, his hands resting on the top rail. "You think you'll stay?" he asked, not looking at her. Mylin smiled. "For a while. Someone's got to keep you out of trouble." Abner chuckled, that low, cowboy laugh that came from deep in his chest. "I guess that means I'm stuck with you, then." For a moment, a peaceful silence settled between them, filled only by the whisper of the wind, the rustle of dry grass, and the quiet rhythm of a life starting over. Abner finally turned to her. "You know, for 20 years, I thought this land hated me. I thought maybe it was punishing me for some sin I didn't know I'd committed. But it was never the land. It was me. I was the one who couldn't let go." He tapped the solid fence post with his knuckles, as if testing its strength. "And you? You showed me it's all still standing." Mylin nodded, her gaze soft. "We all carry ghosts, Abner. Some just shout louder than others." He looked at her then, his weathered face softened by the morning light. "You remind me that even the worst scars can fade, if you just stop picking at them." She smiled back. "I guess we both learned something." Abner walked over to the fire pit where the ashes of the ledger still lay. He stooped down, picked up a handful of the cold, grey dust, and let it sift through his fingers. "Funny thing," he said. "All those years, folks in this town feared a curse. But it turns out the only real curse is believing in 1 inch." The wind caught the last of the ash from his hand and carried it out across the field. Mylin watched it drift away, glowing for a second in the brilliant sunlight before it disappeared entirely. "Looks like even the ghosts needed a place to rest," she murmured, her voice soft against the breeze. Later, they saddled up and rode out together, the land stretching wide and endless before them. There were no ghosts on the ridge, no fear in the wind, just 2 riders moving toward the horizon, toward something new. Maybe that's the point, isn't it? That sometimes the worst thing we face isn't the prejudice of others, but the poison we allow ourselves to believe. Maybe every curse is just a story, waiting for someone brave enough to rewrite the ending. And maybe, somewhere in your own life, there's a truth you've been too scared to dig up, a ghost waiting not for a fight, but simply to be set free.